So, here is the subject of my talk. Erich von Falkenhayn. And now I start with a quote. È opinione del generale von Falkenhayn che noi tutti siamo stati ciechi. Now you will say this sounds more like Italian than German, and it is Italian. And I go on. It is an opinion of General von Falkenhayn that we all were blind. The Russo-Japanese war should have enlightened us regarding the tactical consequences of the new weapons and the forms of combat that will result from them. Instead, we try to explain the return to positional warfare, which was characteristic for that campaign, by the logistical conditions of the combatants, their traditional attitudes and the like, instead of simply recognizing the effect of the new weapons. Now you can ask, why is a quote in Italian? Because that one is, of course, a translation. It is from a report which the Italian military attaché in Berlin, Tenente Colonnello Luigi Bongiovanni, sent to Rome on the 15th of December 1914. The German chief of staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, who was a very reserved man, probably like Haig, spoke quite openly with Giovanni about the ongoing war for two reasons. The first one, they were friends. It happened that they were friends. The Italian officer who knew German had met Falkenhayn in China during the Boxer War, and they were both 1901 in the provisional military government of Tianjin. So Falkenhayn is there and Bongiovanni is there. The second and obviously real reason for the conversation was that Falkenhayn wanted to convince the Italians, the last neutral great power in Europe, not to enter the war on the side of the enemies, and therefore spoke very openly about the murderous fighting conditions on the Western Front. My paper will now deal with the question of this conference, 1913, expectations meet the realities of war. Now, I have to admit my guilt. I'm not sticking to the year 1913 in a strict way. I interpreted expectations of war in a longer period of time before 1914. The first question which I want to ask is, was Falkenhayn's comment correct? Only because he said that it's not given that it was correct. So were the military specialists in Europe before 1914 blind and did not understand the message of the Russo-Japanese War or the Boer War or other military conflicts of the time? We have many possibilities to check that. One would be to analyze military books, instructions, military manuals, journals and pamphlets of the period. If we take, for example, the German case, then we have here, if I go through that, the German Army newspaper, Deutsche Heereszeitung, Marine-Rundschau, the Naval Journal, the Engineers Journal, Kriegstechnische Zeitschrift, the very important Militärwochenblatt, Military Weekly, and the Kavalleristische Monatshefte, Cavalry Monthly. And we could go through all these journals to find out what the authors thought about the future war. Of course, that would be a daunting task, but it is done. So there is quite a lot of research available. And the result of that is that military specialists before 1914 knew pretty well the effect of military innovation, and also about tactical changes which were caused or had to be considered because of this technical developments. They understood especially well the role of overwhelming firepower on the battlefield. of artillery, machine guns, and magazine rifles. No question about that. The majority of all military writers was, to offer only one example, on average very skeptical towards the future of cavalry on the battlefield, because they said that cavalry charges would be a suicidal act against quick-firing, well-armed infantry. So many military writers had a quite accurate idea about future warfare, but only regarding the details. This means the specialists writing on those topics, like, for example, normally an officer of infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineer, wrote about the technical innovations in their field, and they did not discuss questions like the future war or something like that. This is a little bit like the discussion on the battlefield in Ukraine. In our days, we hear a lot about details, but rarely something which is really comprehensive. But still, also before 1914, we had some people who dealt with the question to bring all this development in a bigger picture. One of them, I suppose most of you, all of you will know him, is a Polish banker and magnate, Jan Bloch, who analyzed military journals and edited a 6-volume work, Future War and its Economic Consequences, which is better known under its English title, Is War Now Impossible? Bloch considered future war because of modern weaponry as possible, but also as sheer suicide. Bloch's 6-volume work based exactly on the analysis of military journals, as I have shown you before. But his conclusions that war was now impossible because it was tantamount to suicide were not shared by professional soldiers. The counter-argument was probably that it was not in one's hand to abolish war. War remained a distinctive possibility, and therefore it was a soldier's duty to prepare for it. Furthermore, talking too much about the devastating effect of modern weaponry endangered morale. Bloch was not liked by professional soldiers, but his arguments were even discussed in the Royal United Service Institution in Whitehall in 1901. So we cannot say that he was completely disregarded. It is not true. Another thinker on modern war is much more known to everybody. It was, of course, Alfred Graf Schlieffen, who saw the dangers of modern war or the developments of modern war probably in a similar light like Bloch, but gave completely different answers. His answers were completely to adapt tactics and strategy to technical developments and make war doable and winnable should it happen. Therefore, a first summary. Falkenhayn's statement, we were all blind, we have all been blind, was kind of incorrect. He said that, but it is not true. It was more a case of rejecting available information for other reasons. One of them may also be that German soldiers, and among them Falkenhayn, probably thought with Moltke the Elder, I quote, "Eternal peace is just a dream, and not even a beautiful one." End of quote. I make a further claim. I don't believe that the assumptions and expectations about war before 1914 were driven by the evaluation of technical developments, but by different factors. And I want to prove that to take Falkenhayn as an example. But first, I have to present Falkenhayn a little bit closer, because showing his military career is not unimportant for answering the questions properly. And I made here a timeline. In 1861, he was born and when he was 11 years old, he was straight sent to a cadet school, made then a good military career until 1896, attended the War Academy, was an captain, and then suddenly he left the service to go as an instructor to China. He was military instructor to China, which was a completely unusual move in the Prussian army, and stayed there until 1900. And then from 1900 to 1903, he was with an international expedition against the Boxer War. So then it continues. He came back from China in 1903, was battalion commander in Braunschweig, was then 2 years in the Great General Staff in Berlin, was then Chief of Staff of the 14th Army Corps in Metz, was then commander of the 1st Guard Regiment zu Fuß, well, 4th Garde-Regiment zu Fuß, which is an extremely prestigious guard regiment. It was a great honor to do that, to be commander of this regiment. Then in 1912, he became again Chief of Staff of the 4th Army Corps in Magdeburg. In 1913, in summer 1913, he became Prussian Minister of War as one of the youngest Prussian ministers of war ever. And in 1914, he became Chief of Staff, staying in this office until late August 1916. So that is basically the career in a nutshell. And I spare you what he did after 1916. Out of the kindness of my heart. It would be naive to think that somebody with this military experience did not notice rapid technical change, and therefore probably also the changing character of war. The opposite was, of course, the case. Falkenhayn had to deal with that on a daily basis. I make now some examples. While he was working in the General Staff in Berlin, he became responsible for the motorization of the German army. And he even invented a quite clever scheme to buy lorries. And to soften the expense for the army, it was a premium system for civilian entrepreneurs to buy lorries who, in case of war, would be used by the army. In Metz and in Magdeburg, as a Chief of Staff of the Army Corps, he organized regular maneuvers, big maneuvers, dealt in special exercises with signaling and wireless and motor cars and all kind of modern technology. Technical change was everywhere, and Falkenhayn was also a big supporter of especially everything flying. Aeroplanes, to a lesser extent of Zeppelins, and he saw here a big revolution of warfare coming. These are his words, revolution of warfare. Well, the next question, but what were Falkenhayn's expectations regarding the future war? The first comment which I have to make is that Falkenhayn considered himself to be a practitioner. He thought general staff work, and this is kind of surprising if you know that the guy became Chief of Staff, he considered general staff work at the Green Table as to be terribly boring. And he complained all the time to fight paper battles who had absolutely no interest for him. So he was an excellent and energetic general staff officer, but not a strategic thinker or a theoretical mind. And he did not discuss in his surviving pre-war correspondences how he imagined a future war. You don't find that. But he was talking about war in his pre-war correspondence a lot. And I would say obsessively. He was obsessively talking about war, and that is now my next argument. Falkenhayn wrote also a lot about politics, and normally discussing the question if he saw war coming or not. That was basically what his entire pre-war correspondence is about. is war coming or not? And it is necessary to make it clear that he was hoping that war would come, not the opposite. He was not afraid of war coming, he was afraid that war would not come. Falkenhayn was kriegsfreudig. It's a German word which you cannot translate literally. And Bethmann Hollweg used this word about Falkenhayn. Kriegsfreudig means, probably the best translation is war enthusiasm. He was a war enthusiast. He was dreaming of war, and he complained constantly about the boredom of being a peacetime soldier. Let me quote him. First quote, "I would be quite content if not any hope that the internal preparation and exercise would finally result in action had disappeared." This is a quote from May 1909. Or, another quote, "Things will become only better if the great general conflagration which is to be expected next spring has cleared the air," in November 1911. Or, "I am tired and completely fed up with this lazy peacetime life," in September 1912. Why did he desire war? Could ask, maybe because he thought it would be politically advantageous? Maybe. But this looks in places like a mere pretext to hide the real reason. And the real reason was a personal one. He wanted war because he was a soldier. War was his job. He hated it to be a peacetime soldier, and he wanted real action. He wanted to prove his abilities in a war, even if he admitted, at least in a letter of the 30th of September 1912, that a great European war would massively benefit only the non-participants, we'll say the United States of America and Japan. To make it clear, I believe that Falkenhayn was not alone with this attitude, and that probably many professional soldiers before 1914 had similar views, which may go along with the Royal Navy's Thursday toast, which you probably know much better than me: a bloody war and quick promotion. But most of them were lucky enough that the evidence got lost or was destroyed on purpose. Falkenhayn's correspondence survived, so we can prove it, and these views showed that he interpreted political and military events on the basis of deep-rooted assumptions. One example is the Russo-Japanese War, which I mentioned at the very beginning in this quote. Falkenhayn commented in several private letters on this war. He thought the Russians would win because he considered them to be stronger. He praised Russian logistics for being able to bring troops and material with a transit to Eastern Asia. He even advocated that Germany might join the conflict on Russia's side and was delighted about this prospect. Later on, he became more critical and complained, for example, about the pitiful Russian Navy. What does that mean for our question? Falkenhayn did not analyze new weapons. He did not speak about trench warfare in the Far East or something like that. But he judged the war mainly because of his pre-existing assumptions about the strengths of the belligerents and his own political preferences. He made similar comments on the French and British. He was in early 1910 in Paris to visit a friend of his, a French colonel from Chinese times, and commented on this occasion on the French, which he respected and loved. He spoke excellent French and he loved French culture. But he said about the French, quote, it looks as if the character of our dear neighbors did not change much since 1870. I anyway do not believe much in the theory of learning by disaster, end of quote. We'll say he thought the French are still the same as 1870. He was very hostile, I have now to ask sorry for Falkenhayn, he was very hostile towards Britain and saw Britain as a dangerous and coldly calculating enemy. He wrote after the Second Moroccan Crisis, I quote, "As far as one can see, a war between England and Germany is unavoidable. The disgrace inflicted on us by our dear blood relatives in this year of miscontent will not be forgotten by Prussian spirit and Prussian pride." End of quote. Falkenhayn had certain ideas about the military strength and values of European states and societies and of their potential performance and behavior in a future war. His judgments on technical developments were important as well. He complained, for example, about advantages the French had made in aviation and thought the French had the upper hand and would, for example, threaten German Rhine bridges in case of war. But still, I would claim that his assumptions about European nations were more important to understand his later strategy. So we understand in his pre-war correspondence that he had high respect for Russia's, quote, latent but enormous strengths. He liked the French and held them in high regard, but he thought they are no match for Germany. And he thought that Britain was Germany's most dangerous enemy, a coldly calculating power. And if we take these three ideas, we have a good guideline of how his strategy as a chief of staff between 1914 and 1918 would evolve. Let me now make a jump forward from expectations, which I dealt with until now, to realities. During the July crisis 1914, Falkenhayn was, as Prussian Minister of War, one of the few members of the leadership in Berlin who could decide over war and peace. Now you can ask, were these decisions about war and peace in good hands with a man who desired war and was bought as a peacetime soldier? The answer is surprisingly difficult to make, because Falkenhayn's attitude was strangely ambiguous, torn between political pragmatism and desire for war, but overall more consistent than the attitude of the Chief of Staff, Moltke the Younger, here. Moltke suffered during the July crisis under the bias, on the one hand, the enormous responsibility for a world war and the disaster for Europe, and his own desire for war. He was torn. Falkenhayn was much cooler and controlled. And when war broke out, Falkenhayn said to an American diplomat that the war may last for several years and that its outcome was uncertain. He said also to Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg in early August 1914, I quote, "Even if we may perish, it was wonderful." And the last sentence fits him well, because he was a kind of military dandy, and his biting, sarcastic jokes, which created the impression of a certain unearnest or nihilism, of course, did not create him many friends. Let me ask you one question. Was Falkenhayn the warmonger a monster? Can we, as a historian, consider him a monster? Maybe we can. And we may wish that Europe had been ruled in 1914 by men who despised war and did not desire it. But if so, Winston Churchill was a monster as well. He had a moment of crisis at the end of July 1914, reflected on suicide after the moderate Serbian reply to the Austrian ultimatum and said, if war can be avoided, I lived for nothing. And later, Winston Churchill wrote to his wife on July 28, 1914, everything tends towards catastrophe and collapse. I'm interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me. I pray to God to forgive me for such fearful moods of levity. End of quote. Well, this is how Churchill and also how Falkenhayn were built. It was Falkenhayn's personality, but it was also the attitude of a Prussian officer, which others expected from him. Because the German Foreign Minister Gottlieb von Jagow said in 1913, finally our year of departure, soldiers who dream of peace are a monstrosity. End of quote. Here we are now at the outbreak of war in August 1914, and here we are also at the moment where we can check expectations and realities. The first observation which I want to make is that the war was, under whatever possible metrics possible, for Falkenhayn and Germany not an enjoyment. Falkenhayn had wanted in 1914, I quote, a serious fight. He had said, we need a struggle for life with all its horrors, but also wonderful developments to prevent us from suffocating in lies, self-praise, and laziness. End of quote. The war never delivered on these expectations. The war was not a fountain of youth. You know, we have this image in Germany. You go to a fountain as an old man and you come out as a young one. This expectation did not happen. It did not make individuals and societies stronger, but the exact opposite happened. And it brought for Falkenhayn as a person enormous superhuman stress, sleepless nights, and countless bitter animosities. Falkenhayn was in summer 1914 a youthful, very elegant appearance. During his 2 years as chief of staff, he became an old man, according to General Wilhelm Gröner in summer 1916. Of course, things became worse the longer the war lasted. During the first months of the war, Falkenhayn believed that, like many others in Germany, that the war would be won quite quickly. This changed after the first Battle of Ypres, an operation for which he already bore the full responsibility as being chief of staff. Its failure in November 1914 meant that all German attempts to win in the West had vanished, and trench warfare from the Swiss border to the North Sea was a reality. Falkenhayn showed in this moment his better side, pragmatism, and learned quickly. He understood, faster than anybody else in the German leadership, that Germany did not have the military power to win on all fronts, that a decisive victory in East or West was not achievable, that trench warfare made any attack on the Western Front a senseless carnage, and that the war had to end with a political compromise. He told in November 1914 Reichschancellor Bethmann-Hollweg that the army could not deliver victory and that a political solution of the war was urgently required. That was a very important move. Imagine a general goes to his government and says, you have to look for a political solution. The army cannot do it. It was important that he did it, even if his idea to try to broker a separate peace with Russia or France was unrealistic because the enemy coalition had decided to stick together. Falkenhayn was not insisting on annexations. From late November 1914 onwards, he said, if we don't lose the war, we have won it. He had a hard stand against the majority of the army leadership who thought that still a decisive victory would be possible and who lacked Falkenhayn's realism. He instead said, we must make the enemies understand that they cannot afford the price to overwhelm us. That sounds different, like winning the war. Basically, this sounds like holding out. His strategy maneuvered along these lines, but had to deal with one enormous and unsurmountable problem. If there was no political solution, how to conduct a war if it is militarily not winnable? So basically, this is an impossible task, and made worse by his feeling that the enemy will win by gaining time to be able to mobilize its worldwide resources. Germany would be exhausted in due course. So he had, as a strategist, a pretty comprehensive understanding of the overall factors of war. His strategy, not surprisingly, was working along his pre-war assumptions. His pre-war assumptions, and in August 1914, to start with one argument, he said, the final aim of this war is to fight against England. He wanted a separate peace with Russia and also with France, but he thought that the French would bend at some point under German pressure. And this belief was surely one of the reasons why he decided to attack Verdun in 1916. Verdun was, by the way, not planned as a breakthrough because Falkenhayn did not believe that a breakthrough in trench warfare was possible, and he thought this will only work after the invention of new weapons. And we can call his attitude the Falkenhayn doctrine. He said in November 1914 that the first lesson of the war was, I quote, keep what you have and don't give up an inch of what you gained. Well, I want to leave it here because to talk more about Falkenhayn's tenure as a chief of staff would overstretch my time and your patience. But there's a loose end. Because I started my paper with Falkenhayn's warning to the Italians, right? You may vaguely recall that. Short-time memory test, yeah? And his warnings about the murderous nature of trench warfare. And you may ask, what happened with these warnings? How did the Italians react on them? Well, let me start with Tenente Colonnello Luigi Bongiovanni, the military attaché in Berlin. At least he took it seriously, very seriously. He reported extensively and in very long and detailed reports about trench warfare to Rome. Here are now 3 random copies of reports of his about trench warfare, and here, even if you don't go through the Italian text, you see here easily what he is explaining in this memoranda. It's several long memoranda. Bongiovanni did more. He called the fightings on the Western Front vani e terribili holocausti di vite umane. This means senseless and terrible holocausts of human lives. He used the word Holocaust for the fightings on the Western Front. And he tried very hard to convince his general staff that Italy would face trench warfare if it entered the war, and that they should prepare for trench warfare. As all of you know, his warnings were in vain, and the chief of staff Luigi Cadorna and the other decision makers in Italy went on undeterred with their super optimistic campaign planning. And Vanderwoord will talk about that in more detail later. The Italian intervento started on the 23rd of May 1915 and ended in a terrible static trench warfare, which was by no means better than the fightings on the Western Front. Well, this was surely a bad example of learning from experience, or of learning from the bad experience of others, or of the complete failure of learning at all. And this was exactly what my paper at the end was about. Thank you very much.
Out so kick it off and tears fall.